60,000 years ago, the world froze. Tonight you'll discover how our cousins survived the impossible. The wind screamed across the frozen steppes of Europe, carrying with it a cold that could kill in minutes. Temperatures had plummeted to minus 27 degrees Celsius. That's minus 17 Fahrenheit. A group of stocky figures moved through the blizzard. They were not like us. Their noses were massive. Their brow ridges protruded dramatically. Their bodies were built like barrels, short and impossibly strong. They looked different, but they were unquestionably human. They were Neanderthals. These people have long been dismissed as brutish cave dwellers, simple-minded brutes who couldn't possibly compete with our clever ancestors. However, discoveries have revealed something extraordinary. So if these stories help you relax or whatever, hit like or subscribe. Also curious where everyone's at? Comment your city and time. Reading through last video's comments and seeing Miami, Manchester and Melbourne all in there. The internet's weird, right? Neanderthals didn't just survive the ice ages, they thrived in them. For over 300,000 years, these people endured conditions that would have killed modern humans in days. While our ancestors huddled near the equator in Africa's warmth, Neanderthals conquered a frozen world. They lived through not one, not two, but multiple ice ages that turned Europe into a frozen wasteland. How did they do it? The answer challenges everything we thought we knew about our evolutionary cousins. It turns out these people were pioneers of cold weather survival. They developed technologies and strategies that wouldn't be reinvented for tens of thousands of years. Let me paint you a picture of their world. Imagine Europe, but not the Europe you know. The English Channel doesn't exist. It's dry land covered in ice. Scandinavia is buried under glaciers 2 miles thick. The Mediterranean coast, usually warm and inviting, sees a regular snowfall. In this frozen hell, massive beasts roamed. Woolly mammoths trudged through the snow, their tusks curved like ancient question marks. Cave bears, standing 12 feet tall when reared up, competed for the same shelters these people needed. Woolly rhinoceros, built like tanks covered in fur, charged anything that threatened them. These were not gentle times. Cave lions, larger than any lion alive today, stalked the frozen plains. They were apex predators with no fear of humans. Hyenas, massive and aggressive, would steal kills from anyone not strong enough to defend them. Even wolves were different then. Bigger, meaner, adapted to the cold in ways that made them perfect killing machines. Yet in this world of ice and death, Neanderthals built a life. The secret to their survival wasn't one thing, it was everything. Every aspect of their existence was shaped by the cold. Their bodice, their technology, their social structures, all of it evolved to beat the ice. Let's start with their bodies. Neanderthals were built for the cold in ways that seem almost engineered. They had what scientists call a hyperarctic body type. Short limbs, barrel chests, and a body mass that would make modern humans look scrawny. This wasn't random. It was physics. A sphere loses less heat than a stick. By being short and stocky, Neanderthals reduced their surface area while maintaining their volume. Less surface area meant less heat loss. It's the same reason why Inuit peoples today have similar body proportions. Evolution found the same solution twice, but it went deeper than just shape. Their metabolism was a furnace. While we modern humans need about 2,000 calories a day, Neanderthals needed between 3,300 and 4,500 calories every single day. That's like eating 7 Big Macs just to maintain body weight. Where did all those calories go? Heat. Pure body heat. Their muscles weren't just for strength, they were radiators. Muscle tissue produces more heat than fat, and Neanderthals were absolutely ripped. Archaeological evidence shows muscle attachment points on their bones that indicate strength levels that would put Olympic athletes to shame. Their noses tell another story. Those large, prominent noses weren't a random feature. They were sophisticated air conditioning units. When you breathe -20-degree air directly into your lungs, it can cause serious damage. The Neanderthal nose warmed and humidified that air before it reached their lungs. The internal structure was like a radiator in reverse, with maximum surface area to heat the incoming air. Recent studies have shown something even more remarkable. Neanderthal DNA reveals they had a gene variant similar to one found in woolly mammoths. This gene, related to fat storage and heat production, suggests they may have had brown adipose tissue, a special type of fat that burns calories just to produce heat. Babies have it. Most adults lose it. Neanderthals may have kept it their entire lives, but bodies alone don't explain their survival. These people faced a challenge that would have defeated pure biology. The cold of the Ice Age wasn't like a cold winter day. It was a crushing, endless freeze that lasted for thousands of years. Winters where the temperature never rose above freezing. Summers that felt like winter. Years where the sun barely penetrated the clouds of dust and ice crystals in the atmosphere. To survive this, Neanderthals needed technology. The first and most important was fire. But here's where things get strange. We have evidence that Neanderthals could make fire at least 50,000 years ago. They struck pieces of pyrite against flint to create sparks. These sparks would catch on dried fungus or grass, creating flame, but they didn't always use it. This discovery has baffled archaeologists. Sites from the coldest periods of the Ice Age sometimes show no evidence of fire use at all. How could they survive -20-degree temperatures without fire? The answer might lie in an even more shocking discovery. Some researchers believe Neanderthals could hibernate. I know how that sounds. Humans don't hibernate. It seems impossible. But the evidence is compelling. Neanderthal bones from Spain show patterns of interrupted growth and healing that match what we see in hibernating animals. The bones tell a story of metabolism slowing down for months at a time. If true, this would be extraordinary. Only a few primates can hibernate. Some lemurs in Madagascar do it. The African lesser bush baby can. But a human relative? It would rewrite our understanding of what's possible for our lineage. Think about what this means. During the harshest months when food was scarce and temperatures deadly, these people might have simply turned off. They would have retreated deep into caves, their metabolisms dropping to a crawl, their body temperatures falling, living off stored fat until spring returned. But hibernation was probably a last resort. Most of the time, Neanderthals stayed active through winter. They had to. The big game they hunted, reindeer, horses, mammoths, moved constantly. Following the herds meant survival. Staying in one place meant starvation. This brings us to their hunting. Neanderthals were apex predators, but not in the way we usually think of the term. They didn't chase prey across the plains like wolves. They couldn't. Those short legs that conserved heat weren't built for long-distance running. Instead, they were ambush predators. The evidence is written in their bones. Neanderthal skeletons show a pattern of injuries that would make a rodeo rider wince. Broken ribs, fractured skulls, damaged vertebrae, the kinds of injuries you get from being way too close to very large, very angry animals. One study found that Neanderthal injury patterns match those of modern rodeo performers almost perfectly. They were getting up close and personal with mammoths. Imagine the scene. A group of Neanderthals has tracked a young mammoth, separated from its herd by a blizzard. They've been following it for days, waiting for the perfect moment. When it comes to drink at a partially frozen river, they strike. Moving in coordinated silence, they surround it. The attack is swift and brutal, spears thrust between ribs, aiming for lungs and heart. The mammoth bellows, swinging its tusks in deadly arcs. One hunter goes down, ribs cracked by a glancing blow. Another drives his spear deeper. Blood steams in the frozen air. This wasn't hunting, it was combat. And Neanderthals bore the scars to prove it. One skeleton from Iraq, known as Shanidar I, tells a particularly powerful story. This man had survived a blow to the head that partially blinded him. His right arm was withered and possibly amputated. He was partially deaf. He walked with a severe limp from 2 broken legs that had healed poorly. Yet he lived into his 40s. In the Ice Age, that was ancient. This man couldn't hunt. He could barely walk. In a world where survival meant constant struggle, he was kept alive by his group for years, possibly decades. They fed him, protected him, helped him move with the group. This wasn't survival of the fittest. This was compassion. It tells us something profound about these people. They weren't the savage brutes of popular imagination. They were a society, a culture that valued its members beyond their immediate utility. In the harshest environment humans have ever inhabited, they made room for kindness. But compassion alone doesn't explain their success. Neanderthals had another secret weapon: clothing. Now, this is where the archaeological record gets frustrating. Clothing doesn't preserve well. After 40,000 years, animal hides turn to dust. But we can infer a lot from indirect evidence. First, the obvious. You cannot survive -20-degree temperatures naked. Modern humans would die of hypothermia in hours. Even with their cold-adapted bodies, Neanderthals would have needed covering. The question isn't whether they wore clothes, but what kind. This is where Neanderthals may have faced a critical disadvantage. We have never found a Neanderthal needle, not one. Needles are sturdy little artifacts. If Neanderthals had them, we should have found them. Modern humans from the same period left behind thousands of bone needles. They were clearly sewing fitted, tailored clothing. Neanderthals probably weren't. Instead, evidence suggests they wore draped hides. Think of a cloak or poncho rather than a jacket. They processed these hides using tools called lissoirs, made from deer ribs. These tools, polished smooth from use, were perfect for working hides to make them supple and water-resistant. But without needles, they couldn't create tight seams. This matters more than you might think. Loose-fitting clothes lose heat rapidly. Wind cuts through gaps. Snow gets inside. In extreme cold, the difference between tailored and draped clothing could be the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Some archaeologists believe this clothing disadvantage may have contributed to Neanderthal extinction. When modern humans arrived in Europe 45,000 years ago, they brought needle technology with them. Their fitted parkas and trousers would have been like spacesuits compared to Neanderthal cloaks. In the competition for resources during the coldest periods, this edge might have been decisive. But for 300,000 years before modern humans showed up, Neanderthal clothing technology was enough. They made it work through sheer toughness and clever adaptations. They likely wore multiple layers of hides. They probably used leather straps or cordage to tie hides close to their bodies. Evidence from a few sites suggests they even used feathers for insulation, particularly from birds like eagles and vultures. One skeleton from France was found with what appears to be leopard bones arranged in a pattern suggesting a cape. Imagine that. In Ice Age Europe, a Neanderthal wrapped in leopard fur. It wasn't just functional, it was a statement. Just as some Native Americans wore bear or wolf pelts to invoke the spirit of the animal, this Neanderthal may have worn leopard fur as a symbol of status or power. These people had style. But clothing was just one part of a complex survival system. Neanderthals also needed shelter, and here they showed remarkable ingenuity. Yes, they used caves. The stereotype isn't entirely wrong. But they didn't just crawl into any dark hole in the rock. They were selective. Neanderthals chose caves that faced south when possible, maximizing sunlight. They preferred caves with narrow entrances that could be easily defended and that minimized wind exposure. Inside, they organized space with surprising sophistication. At sites across Europe, we find evidence of designated areas. Here was the toolmaking spot marked by thousands of tiny flint chips. There was the cooking area blackened by countless fires. Over there, the sleeping area, sometimes marked by shallow depressions where bodies lay night after night. They even had garbage dumps, specific places where bones and other waste accumulated. This wasn't random cave squatting. This was homemaking. But the most spectacular Neanderthal shelters weren't in caves at all. In Ukraine, at a site called Molodova, archaeologists found something extraordinary. A structure made from mammoth bones built 44,000 years ago. The base was 26 feet across, constructed from skulls, tusks, and leg bones arranged in a careful pattern. This wasn't a temporary shelter. Building it would have taken weeks of coordinated effort. The bones had to be collected, some probably from fresh kills, others scavenged from carcasses. They had to be transported, some weighing hundreds of pounds, then arranged, balanced, and likely covered with hides to create a weatherproof shell. Inside, archaeologists found 25 different hearths. That means this structure was used repeatedly, possibly for generations. It was a landmark, a known safe haven in a dangerous world. When the winds howled and the temperature plummeted, Neanderthals knew they could return to this mammoth house and survive. The bones tell us something else. Some had decorative carvings, others showed traces of ochre, a red pigment Neanderthals used for various purposes. This wasn't just a shelter, it was architecture. It was art. It was a statement of permanence in a world of constant change. These mammoth bone structures appear across Eastern Europe during the coldest periods. When trees became scarce and wood hard to find, Neanderthals innovated. They used what was available, the bones of the very animals they hunted. It's a perfect example of their adaptability, their ability to thrive in conditions that seem impossible. But shelter and clothing could only do so much. The real challenge was food. In Ice Age Europe, winters meant starvation season. Plants died or went dormant. Small animals hibernated or migrated. the landscape became a white desert, beautiful and lethal in equal measure. Neanderthals solved this problem in ways that surprise researchers even today. They became specialists in winter hunting. When the cold months came, they shifted their focus to reindeer. These cold-adapted deer migrated in huge herds, following predictable routes. Neanderthals learned these patterns, setting up ambush sites along migration corridors. At one site in France, archaeologists found evidence of a massive kill. 23 reindeer, 6 ibex, 3 aurochs, and 1 roe deer, all killed in a single autumn season. The entire carcasses were dragged back to a cave and butchered. But here's the remarkable part. This was far too much meat for immediate consumption. The only explanation? Food storage. Neanderthals were preserving meat for the winter ahead. They may have used techniques we see in later cultures: smoking, drying, freezing. In the Ice Age, natural refrigeration was everywhere. Dig a pit in permafrost, pack it with meat, cover it with stones to keep scavengers out, and you have a food supply that could last months. This level of planning required sophisticated thinking. It meant understanding seasons, predicting weather patterns, calculating how much food a group would need for months ahead. It meant delayed gratification, not eating everything now to ensure survival later. These are complex cognitive abilities that we once thought unique to modern humans. But Neanderthals weren't just eating meat. At sites in Spain and Gibraltar, we find evidence of a much more varied diet. Shellfish, collected from rocky shores, dolphins and seals, probably scavenged from beaches but possibly hunted, pine nuts, mushrooms, and moss. One group in Spain appears to have been essentially vegetarian, living on plants and fungi with almost no meat consumption. This dietary flexibility was crucial. When reindeer herds failed to appear, when mammoth hunting went badly, when injuries prevented active hunting, Neanderthals could fall back on other food sources. They knew their environment intimately, which plants were edible, where shellfish congregated, when different foods would be available. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists found something touching. The soil around Neanderthal burials contained unusual concentrations of pollen from flowering plants. Initially interpreted as funeral flowers, the evidence now suggests something else. These plants, yarrow, groundsel, grape hyacinth, are all medicinal. They have antibacterial, anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties. Neanderthals were practicing medicine. Analysis of Neanderthal tooth tartar has confirmed this. We find chemical signatures of plants with no nutritional value but known medicinal properties. Chamomile for inflammation, yarrow for fever. One individual from Spain had remnants of poplar bark in his teeth. It contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. This same individual showed signs of a painful tooth abscess. He was self-medicating for pain. Even more remarkably, this individual also had traces of Penicillium mold, the source of penicillin. Whether this was intentional or accidental, we can't know. But the fact remains, 50,000 years before Fleming discovered antibiotics, a Neanderthal was consuming them. This knowledge wasn't casual or accidental. It represented generations of accumulated wisdom, passed down through families and tribes. Which plants helped with which ailments, how to prepare them, when to harvest them, dosages and applications. This was sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge, developed through trial and error over millennia. But medicine could only do so much in the Ice Age. The cold itself was a constant enemy. Beyond the obvious danger of freezing to death, cold brought a host of other problems. Frostbite could claim fingers, toes, noses. Minor injuries became major problems when healing slowed in low temperatures. Vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight weakened bones and immune systems. Yet somehow Neanderthals managed these challenges for thousands of generations. Part of their success came from their social structure. Neanderthals lived in small groups, typically 10 to 30 individuals. This might seem like a disadvantage compared to the larger groups of modern humans. But small groups had benefits in the Ice Age environment. They required less food. A group of 15 could survive on a single reindeer for days. A group of 50 would strip it clean in one meal. Small groups could shelter in modest caves. They could move quickly when following herds. They created less noise when hunting. But small groups also faced unique challenges. Finding mates outside your immediate family required contact with other groups. Genetic evidence shows that Neanderthal women typically left their birth groups to join their mates' families. This means Neanderthal groups weren't isolated. They maintained networks, meeting periodically to exchange members and presumably information. Imagine these meetings. After months of isolation, two groups encounter each other at a summer gathering spot. There would be excitement, reunion with relatives, sharing of news. Young adults would eye each other as potential mates. Elders would exchange information about herds, weather patterns, new hunting grounds. These gatherings were crucial for survival. They prevented inbreeding, spread innovations, maintained cultural traditions. A technique discovered by one group, a new way to work flint, a better method for preserving meat, could spread across populations. Language, whatever form it took, would have been essential for these exchanges. And Neanderthals did have language. The evidence is compelling. They had the anatomical equipment, a hyoid bone virtually identical to ours, the neurological structures for speech. They had the cognitive capacity, planning hunts, making complex tools, caring for disabled members all require communication. They had the cultural need, teaching children, coordinating activities, maintaining traditions. What did Neanderthal language sound like? We'll never know for certain, but it was probably different from ours. Their vocal tracts were shaped differently. Their brain structures, while large, were organized differently. Some researchers suggest Neanderthal language might have been more musical, more tonal than modern human speech. It might have been perfect for the Ice Age. In howling blizzards, when visual communication was impossible, a language rich in tones and pitches might carry better than one dependent on consonants. In the close confines of a cave, where loud speech would echo painfully, a subtle musical language would be advantageous. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Neanderthal language is what they used it for. They told stories. They had to. How else do you explain the continuation of complex cultural practices across generations? The knowledge of which plants were medicinal, where animals migrated, how to work stone. All of this required narrative transmission. Somewhere, somewhen, a Neanderthal elder sat by a fire and told younger ones about the time the mammoth herd came early, about the winter that never ended, about the cave bear that killed 3 hunters before it was brought down. These weren't just stories, they were survival manuals encoded in narrative. And they worked. For over 300,000 years, through multiple ice ages, through climate shifts that would devastate modern civilization, Neanderthals persisted. They didn't just survive, They maintained culture, art, and compassion in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The evidence of their humanity is everywhere once you know how to look. At a cave in Spain, deep underground where no natural light penetrates, Neanderthals created art, geometric patterns painted in red ochre, hand stencils created by blowing pigment around a hand pressed to the wall. These paintings are over 64,000 years old, 20,000 years before modern humans arrived in Europe. This wasn't decoration, it was communication across time. Those handprints say, "I was here, I existed, I was human." They're hauntingly familiar, the same impulse that makes children today press their hands into wet cement. The desire to leave a mark, to be remembered. At sites across Europe, we find Neanderthals collecting things with no survival value. Crystals, fossils, shells from species they didn't eat, eagle talons, carefully notched and probably strung as jewellery, a piece of flint carved to look like a face. These weren't tools or food, they were treasures, things kept because they were beautiful or meaningful. This is what separates us from animals, not tool use. Plenty of animals use tools, not language. Many species communicate, not even care for the disabled. Elephants and wolves do that too. What makes us human is this need for meaning beyond survival, for beauty in a harsh world, for connection to something greater than ourselves. Neanderthals had that spark. They painted their bodies with ochre and manganese. They wore feathers from eagles and vultures. They made music, a flute carved from a cave bear bone, 43,000 years old, still playable today. They buried their dead with ceremony, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with tools for the afterlife. In the depths of the Ice Age, in a world that seems designed to crush the spirit, Neanderthals maintained humanity. But their greatest achievement wasn't art or technology or even survival itself. It was the creation of home in an inhospitable world. Every warm cave, every successful hunt, every child raised to adulthood was a victory against entropy. A flame kept burning against the darkness. Think about what that meant on a day-to-day level. A Neanderthal mother, warming her infant against her body through a night when the wind sounds like screaming spirits. A group of hunters sharing the last of their food with an injured companion who can't hunt. Children learning to nap flint by firelight. Their parents patiently correcting their technique. These small moments of warmth in a cold world, they're what allowed Neanderthals to thrive, and thrive they did. At their peak, Neanderthals ranged from Spain to Siberia, from Britain to the Middle East. They adapted to environments from Mediterranean coasts to Arctic tundra. They survived climate changes that drove other species to extinction. For a third of 1,000,000 years, they were the undisputed masters of Ice Age Europe. But mastery doesn't mean ease. Every day was a struggle, every winter a battle. The Ice Age wasn't a single event, but a series of cold periods interrupted by brief warm spells. Just when Neanderthals might have adapted to one set of conditions, the climate would shift again. During cold snaps called Heinrich events, temperatures could drop 10 degrees in a decade. Forests would die, replaced by barren steppe. Animals Neanderthals depended on would disappear, replaced by different species with different behaviours. Rivers would freeze solid. Caves that had been inhabitable would become death traps of ice. Yet Neanderthals adapted to each change. When forests retreated, they learned to hunt plains animals. When reindeer replaced red deer, they changed their hunting strategies. When wood became scarce, they burned bone. When plants disappeared, they found new food sources. This adaptability came at a cost. Neanderthal populations were always small, perhaps 10,000 individuals across all of Europe at any given time. That's fewer people than live in a small modern town, spread across an entire continent. Small populations mean vulnerability to disasters. One harsh winter, one disease outbreak, one failed hunt could eliminate an entire group. The genetic evidence tells a stark story. Neanderthal DNA shows signs of inbreeding, of populations isolated for generations. One woman from Siberia had parents who were half-siblings. This wasn't preference, it was necessity. When the nearest other group is weeks of dangerous travel away, when leaving your territory means risking starvation or predation, your mating options become limited. This genetic isolation may have been Neanderthals' ultimate weakness. Small populations accumulate harmful mutations. Genetic diversity decreases. The ability to adapt to new challenges diminishes. When modern humans arrived with their larger populations and greater genetic diversity, Neanderthals may have been unable to compete, not because they were inferior, but because they were outnumbered. But that's getting ahead of our story. For now, picture them in their prime, a group of Neanderthals around a fire in a cave in France, 45,000 years ago. Outside, snow falls steadily, has been falling for days. The world is white and silent except for the distant howl of wolves. Inside the cave, it's warm. The fire crackles, fed with carefully rationed wood and bone. The smoke rises to the cave ceiling and flows out through a natural chimney. The walls are decorated with handprints and abstract symbols. In one corner, children play with toy animals carved from ivory. An elder is telling a story, hands moving expressively. The others listen, occasionally laughing or gasping. Someone is working on a new spear point, carefully pressure flaking the edges. Another is scraping a hide, preparing it for clothing. A mother nurses an infant, humming softly. This could be any human family, anywhere, any time. The specific challenges they faced were unique to the Ice Age, but the responses, cooperation, creativity, compassion, are universally human. In the harshest environment our species has known, Neanderthals didn't just survive, they lived. They loved, laughed, created, and cared for each other. They looked at the stars and wondered. They honoured their dead and protected their young. They faced tomorrow with hope, even when tomorrow promised nothing but cold and struggle. That's the real achievement of the Neanderthals. Not that they survived the Ice Age, though that alone is remarkable. Not that they developed sophisticated technology and culture, though they did. The real achievement is that they remained human in conditions that could have reduced them to mere survival machines. In the depths of the Ice Age, humanity itself survived, and it survived in the form of a stocky, big-nosed, barrel-chested people who looked different from us but felt all the same things we feel. Fear and hope, love and loss. The need for connection, for meaning, for something beyond the daily struggle to survive. These people were our cousins, separated by a few 100,000 years of evolution. Their DNA lives on in us. Most non-African humans carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal genes. When you shiver in the cold, when your nose runs in winter air, when you feel that deep tiredness that makes you want to hibernate until spring, that might be your inner Neanderthal, the ghost of Ice Age survivors whispering in your genetic code. But genes aren't their only legacy. Every time we gather around a fire, we're participating in a tradition they helped establish. When we care for our sick and elderly, we're following their example. When we decorate our bodies, make music or create art, we're continuing practices they pioneered in Ice Age caves. Neanderthals weren't our ancestors, but they were our predecessors. They showed that humans, in whatever form, could survive anywhere, endure anything, and still maintain that spark that makes us more than animals. In the frozen hell of the Ice Age Europe, they kept the flame of humanity burning. That flame would soon pass to us. Modern humans were stirring in Africa, developing new technologies, preparing for their own exodus into the frozen north. When they arrived in Europe 45,000 years ago, they found a world already inhabited by masters of cold weather survival. What happened when these two human species met? The answer isn't simple. There was conflict, certainly. Resources were too scarce for easy sharing. There was also cooperation. The DNA evidence proves they interbred. There was probably fear and fascination in equal measure, two types of humans recognizing kinship despite differences. But those first meetings were still millennia in the future. For now, in our story, Neanderthals reign supreme in their frozen kingdom. They've solved the puzzle of Ice Age survival through a combination of biological adaptation, technological innovation, and social cooperation. They've proven that humans can thrive anywhere, no matter how hostile the environment. The wind still howls outside the cave, the snow still falls. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, a hunt to organize, firewood to gather, tools to make. The Ice Age isn't ending anytime soon. If anything, it's getting worse. The climate is becoming more unstable, swinging between extremes. But tonight, around the fire, none of that matters. Tonight, there's warmth and light and company. Stories are being told. Children are learning. Bonds are being strengthened. This is what Neanderthals fought for, suffered for, adapted for. Not just survival, but these moments of human connection. In a few hours, the fire will die down to embers. The group will huddle together for warmth, adults on the outside, children protected in the middle. They'll sleep fitfully, someone always half awake to tend the fire, to listen for danger. Dawn will come late and dim through the storm clouds, and when it does, these people will rise and face another day in the Ice Age. They'll do it as they've done for thousands of generations, with courage, with ingenuity, with compassion for each other, with a determination that speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the refusal to surrender, the insistence on not just surviving, but living. The Neanderthals' Ice Age was a crucible that forged humanity itself. In that frozen forge, they hammered out the template for human survival in impossible conditions. They showed that we are more than our environment, more than our circumstances. They proved that even in the coldest, darkest, most hostile conditions imaginable, humans can create warmth, light, and hope. Their story was far from over. The Ice Age would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. New challenges would arise. Diseases, climate catastrophes, competition from newly arrived humans. The world was changing faster than ever before, and adaptation would become ever more difficult. The worst was yet to come. Around 70,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened. A supervolcano called Toba erupted in Indonesia. It was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. The explosion shot ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it circled the globe for years. the sun disappeared. Not metaphorically, literally. For possibly 6 years, volcanic winter gripped the planet. Temperatures plummeted by 15 degrees Celsius globally. In Europe, already locked in Ice Age conditions, this meant temperatures that almost defy comprehension. Minus 40 degrees became common. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath crystallizes and falls to the ground as ice. Trees explode as their sap freezes. Even with their cold adaptations, Neanderthals faced conditions at the very edge of what mammals can survive. Yet, they endured. How? The answer lies in one of the most remarkable discoveries about these people. They had learned to live underground. Not in caves, deeper than that. In cave systems that extended far below the surface, where geothermal heat kept temperatures stable. In Romania, archaeologists found evidence that stuns them to this day. Deep in a cave system, far from any natural light, Neanderthals had created living spaces. They brought in supplies, tools, food. They maintained fires in chambers with natural ventilation. They even created art in these deep places, handprints and symbols painted in total darkness. This wasn't temporary shelter. This was planned survival. These people understood that the surface world had become uninhabitable, so they moved their entire existence underground. Children were born in these depths. Families lived for possibly years without seeing the sun. Think about the psychological strength that required. Modern humans struggle with seasonal depression from a few months of reduced sunlight. These Neanderthals lived in absolute darkness, knowing that the world above was frozen death. Yet they maintained their humanity, their culture, their will to survive. When they finally emerged, the world had changed. The volcanic winter had killed perhaps 90% of all humans on Earth. In Africa, our species nearly went extinct. Genetic evidence suggests we dropped to maybe 10,000 individuals total. But in Europe, Neanderthals had survived in their underground refuges. They emerged into a world emptied of competition. For the next 20,000 years, Neanderthals experienced something like a golden age. With reduced competition from other predators, many had died during the volcanic winter. Neanderthal populations expanded. They refined their technologies. They developed regional cultures with distinct tool-making styles. This is when we see the flowering of Neanderthal creativity. The Châtelperronian industry emerged, a tool-making tradition so sophisticated that archaeologists initially assumed it must have been created by modern humans. These tools included knife blades that wouldn't look out of place in a modern kitchen. Bone tools became common. Jewellery appeared at multiple sites. But even during this golden age, life remained brutal. A Neanderthal from this period, found in France, tells a typical story. He was about 30 years old when he died. His bones show healed fractures in his skull, ribs, and left arm. His teeth were worn down to nubs from a lifetime of using them as tools. Arthritis riddled his spine and joints. This was a successful Neanderthal. He'd lived to 30. Most didn't make it that far. Infant mortality was probably around 50%. If you survived childhood, you might make it to your 20s. Reaching 40 was exceptional. These weren't long lives by our standards, but they were lives fully lived. Every day brought 1,000 small victories. Finding enough firewood to last the night, successfully tracking a herd, knapping a particularly fine stone tool, teaching a child to recognize edible plants. These achievements might seem trivial to us, but for Neanderthals, they were the difference between existence and extinction. Their greatest challenge wasn't the cold anymore. They'd mastered that. The new challenge was instability. The climate had become erratic, switching between extremes without warning. A mild winter might be followed by the coldest summer in centuries. Rainfall patterns shifted. Rivers changed course. Animals migrated to new territories or died off entirely. Neanderthals responded with flexibility that surprises researchers. At one site in Gibraltar, we see them switching between terrestrial and marine resources depending on conditions. When cold drove land animals away, they harvested shellfish, caught fish, even hunted dolphins. When warm periods brought deer and rabbits back, they shifted to land hunting. They were developing what we'd now call a mixed economy. This flexibility extended to their tools. Instead of relying on one type of stone, Neanderthals began using whatever was locally available. Flint, quartzite, limestone. They adapted their techniques to each material. This might seem obvious, but it represents sophisticated understanding of material properties. They were becoming engineers. At multiple sites we find evidence of compound tools, handles attached to stone blades using birch tar, and adhesive Neanderthals manufactured by heating birch bark in oxygen-free conditions. Creating birch tar requires maintaining specific temperatures for hours. Too hot and it burns, too cool and it doesn't form. The fact that Neanderthals could consistently produce this substance shows remarkable technical control. They were also becoming traders. Shells from the Mediterranean have been found at sites hundreds of kilometers inland. Particular types of high-quality flint travelled similar distances. This wasn't accidental transport. This was exchange, probably between groups meeting at seasonal gatherings. Trade means trust. You don't trade with enemies. These exchanges suggest peaceful interactions between groups, possibly cemented by intermarriage, shared rituals, or mutual defense agreements. The Neanderthal world wasn't just scattered bands struggling in isolation. It was a network, a community spread across a continent. This network became crucial as new challenges arose. Around 50,000 years ago, the climate entered a particularly unstable phase. Heinrich Event 4 brought temperatures crashing down. Ice sheets advanced south, covering areas that had been habitable for millennia. Sea levels dropped by over 100 meters as water locked up in ice. The English Channel became a frozen plain. Neanderthals could walk from France to Britain, and they did. We find their tools and remains in places that are now separated by ocean. They were following herds across landscapes that no longer exist, hunting in territories now beneath the waves. But this expansion came with risks. Smaller territories meant more competition between groups. Resources that had been abundant became scarce. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased violence, skeletons with unhealed weapon wounds, defensive injuries, embedded spear points. Neanderthals were fighting each other. Not constantly, not everywhere, but enough to leave traces in the archaeological record. A skull from France shows a healed wound from a sharp weapon. Someone survived being attacked with an axe or spear. Another skeleton from Iraq has a rib pierced by a projectile point. These weren't hunting accidents. This was conflict. Yet even during these tensions, compassion persisted. The individual with the head wound was cared for during recovery. The person with the pierced rib lived for weeks after the injury, long enough for healing to begin. Even enemies, it seems, could become patients. This duality, violence and compassion, defines the Neanderthal experience. They were capable of warfare but preferred peace. They could kill but chose to heal. In a world that demanded brutality for survival, they maintained mercy. This balance, this choice to remain humane despite inhuman conditions, might be their greatest achievement. Around this time, Neanderthals made a technological leap. They developed what archaeologists call the Levallois technique, a method of stoneworking that requires planning several steps ahead. Instead of just knocking flakes off a rock, they shaped a core to predetermined specifications, then struck off flakes that were already the desired shape. This is like 3D chess in stone. You have to visualize the final product inside the raw material. You have to plan your strikes in sequence. One wrong hit ruins the entire core. It requires spatial reasoning that challenges modern humans who try to learn it. Yet Neanderthal children were learning this technique. At sites across Europe, we find practice pieces, cores worked by inexperienced hands, showing the mistakes and corrections of learners. This wasn't instinctive behavior, it was culture, transmitted through teaching, refined through practice, improved over generations. The Levallois technique gave Neanderthals an edge. The prepared flakes were sharper, more consistent, more efficient than previous tools. One core could produce multiple tools. When you're carrying everything you own while following herds, efficiency matters. Every gram of weight, every bit of space, has to justify itself. But tools were just the beginning. Neanderthals were developing what we might call technology systems. They weren't just making individual tools, but entire toolkits designed to work together. Scrapers for hide preparation, awls for piercing, knives for cutting, hammer stones for breaking bones. Each tool had a purpose, and together they formed an integrated system. This systematic approach extended to hunting. At a site in the Channel Islands, which weren't islands then, archaeologists found evidence of a mammoth drive. Neanderthals had driven an entire herd off a cliff, killing multiple animals at once. This wasn't opportunistic hunting. This was planned, coordinated, and executed with precision. The logistics are staggering. First, they had to find the herd, then maneuver it toward the cliff without causing a stampede in the wrong direction. They needed people positioned to prevent escape, others to drive the animals forward, still others waiting below to finish off survivors and begin butchering. This required communication, planning, and perfect timing. One mistake and the herd escapes. Worse, one mistake and hunters get trampled. The fact that we find multiple drive sites means Neanderthals pulled this off repeatedly. They had turned one of the most dangerous hunting strategies imaginable into routine practice. But not all food came from such dramatic efforts. Neanderthals were also patient gatherers. At sites in the Middle East we find grinding stones worn smooth from processing nuts and seeds. Plant remains preserved in dental calculus show they ate dates, legumes, grasses. Some individuals show wear patterns on their teeth consistent with stripping seeds from stalks. This patient work often fell to those who couldn't hunt. The elderly, the injured, pregnant women, children. They contributed by gathering, processing, and preparing plant foods. Everyone had a role. Everyone contributed. The group survived because every member mattered. This inclusive approach extended to child rearing. Neanderthal children grew up slowly like modern humans. Their brains needed time to develop, to absorb the vast amount of cultural knowledge necessary for survival. This long childhood required extensive parental investment. In a world where adults rarely lived past 30, raising children to independence was a race against time. The evidence suggests they usually won that race. We find adolescent Neanderthals at many sites, individuals who survived childhood and were learning adult skills. Their bones show the beginnings of the stress patterns that marked adult life. The initial stages of arthritis, the first healed fractures, the wear from repetitive tasks. These teenagers were the future of their people. They were learning not just practical skills but cultural ones, how to read weather patterns, where to find medicinal plants, which caves made good shelters, the stories of their ancestors, the rituals of their people, the unwritten rules that governed their society. All of this knowledge had to be transmitted orally. Neanderthals left no written records. Everything they knew existed only in memory, passed from one generation to the next through words, demonstrations, and shared experience. The loss of even one elder could mean the loss of irreplaceable knowledge. This made their burial practices especially poignant. When Neanderthals buried their dead, they weren't just disposing of bodies. They were saying goodbye to libraries, to repositories of survival wisdom accumulated over lifetimes. The death of an experienced hunter meant the loss of decades of tracking knowledge. The death of a healer meant the loss of medicinal expertise. No wonder they treated their dead with such care. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, an elderly Neanderthal was buried in a pit deliberately dug into the cave floor. His body was carefully positioned, possibly with his head resting on a stone pillow. Around him were placed tools and pieces of red ochre. This wasn't disposal, this was ritual. The ochre is particularly significant. Red ochre has no practical value. You can't eat it, wear it, or hunt with it. Its only purpose is symbolic, perhaps representing blood, life, or transformation. The fact that Neanderthals included it in burial suggests they had concepts of meaning beyond the material. They were thinking about death, and possibly what came after. At another site, a child was buried with a piece of mammoth ivory placed over its head. The ivory had been worked, shaped deliberately. Someone had taken time from survival tasks to create a grave good for a child who would never grow up. This is heartbreaking humanity. In a world where every calorie counted, where every moment of labor was precious, Neanderthals chose to spend resources on the dead. They could have used that time to hunt, to gather firewood, to make tools. Instead, they used it to honor those they'd lost. But death wasn't the only thing they ritualized. At multiple sites, we find evidence of Neanderthal gatherings that seem ceremonial rather than practical. Circles of mammoth skulls, arrangements of cave bear bones, collections of unusual stones with no utilitarian purpose. These appear to be monuments, markers, or ritual spaces. One site in particular stands out. Deep in Bruniquel Cave in France, someone built circular structures from broken stalagmites. The structures are 176,000 years old, long before modern humans reached Europe. The builders had to work by firelight deep underground for no practical purpose we can discern. This was architecture as art. The rings are large. One is nearly 7 meters across. Building them required breaking hundreds of stalagmites. some weighing over 50 kilograms. The pieces were arranged carefully, some stacked, some leaning against each other. Traces of fire show burning occurred within the structures. Why build this? We'll never know for certain, but the effort involved suggests powerful motivation. This wasn't casual construction. This was a project planned and executed with purpose. Maybe it was religious, maybe social, maybe it was simply the Neanderthal equivalent of because we can. Whatever the reason, it shows Neanderthals thinking beyond survival. They had the cognitive surplus to imagine, plan, and create something with no immediate practical benefit. In the harsh Ice Age world, they made time for the impractical, the symbolic, the meaningful. This cognitive complexity extended to their understanding of the natural world. Neanderthals were scientists in their own way. They observed patterns, formed hypotheses, tested them through experience. They knew that certain clouds meant storms, that certain animal behaviors predicted weather changes, that certain plants appeared at specific times of year. This knowledge allowed them to predict and prepare. When the leaves turned a certain way, they knew winter was coming early. When certain birds migrated, they knew to follow. When the moon was full, they knew the tides would be highest, exposing shellfish beds normally underwater. They were reading the world like a book. Every broken twig, every track in the mud, every change in the wind carried information. A skilled Neanderthal could probably tell you the species, size, speed, and direction of an animal from its tracks. They could predict weather days in advance. They could find water in a desert and food in a wasteland. This expertise didn't come from intelligence alone. It came from attention, from caring deeply about the details of their world. Modern humans often walk through nature blind to its signals. Neanderthals couldn't afford such obliviousness. Their survival depended on noticing everything, and they did notice everything. At sites across Europe, we find Neanderthals collected fossils, ancient shells, millions of years old carried far from their sources, crystallized minerals with no practical value, stones with natural holes that resembled eyes. These weren't tools or food, they were curiosities, things that caught Neanderthal attention and were deemed worth keeping. They were wondering about the world. What did they think these fossils were? Messages from gods? Remnants of ancient floods? Magic talismans? We can only guess. But the fact that they collected them shows Neanderthals asking questions about their world's history, about things beyond their immediate experience. This curiosity extended to other humans. As Neanderthals expanded their range, they encountered other human populations. In the Middle East, they overlapped with early modern humans for thousands of years. The archaeological record shows both species using the same caves, though not simultaneously. These encounters weren't always peaceful, but they weren't always violent either. The genetic evidence proves that conclusively. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred repeatedly over thousands of years. These weren't rare events, but regular occurrences wherever the species met. Think about what this means. Two types of humans separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution recognized each other as potential mates. Despite different bodies, different faces, possibly different languages, they saw past the differences to the humanity beneath. The children of these unions were viable, fertile, successful. They carried traits from both parents, the cold adaptations of Neanderthals, the technological innovations of modern humans. These hybrid individuals might have been the perfect Ice Age humans, combining the best of both lineages. We are their descendants. Most non-African humans today carry Neanderthal DNA. When we get sick, Neanderthal genes help fight infection. When we face cold, Neanderthal adaptations help us survive. In a very real sense, Neanderthals aren't extinct. They live on in us. But that merger was still in the future. For now, in our timeline, Neanderthals faced their challenges alone, and new challenges were emerging. The climate was becoming even more unstable. Food sources were failing. And from the south, something new was approaching. Modern humans were on the move. They developed new technologies, projectile weapons that could kill at distance, sewing needles for fitted clothing, sophisticated planning abilities that allowed larger group coordination. They were spreading out of Africa in waves, each wave pushing further north. Neanderthals had no way of knowing what was coming. For 300,000 years, they'd been the only humans in Europe. They'd survived everything the Ice Age threw at them. They'd built cultures, traditions, and ways of life perfectly adapted to their world. But their world was about to change. 45,000 years ago, everything changed. The first modern humans to enter Europe weren't conquerors, they were refugees. Climate chaos in the Middle East had driven them north, searching for new hunting grounds. They followed the Danube River Valley, moving cautiously into territories they'd only heard about in stories. What they found shocked them. This wasn't empty land waiting to be claimed. Every cave worth inhabiting was already occupied. Every good hunting ground had its masters. Every river crossing, every sheltered valley, every source of good flint was known, used, controlled. The masters were Neanderthals. The first meeting probably happened by accident. A modern human hunting party, following deer tracks, suddenly faced with beings that were almost human but not quite. Broader, more muscular, with those distinctive faces. The Neanderthal hunting party, equally surprised, confronting tall, slender strangers with strange tools and strange ways. Both groups would have been terrified, not of violence, not immediately, but of the uncanny. That disturbing feeling when something is almost familiar but wrong, like looking in a distorted mirror. These were humans, clearly, but different humans. How did they communicate? Language was certainly different, but hunters have universal signals, raised hands for peace, lowered spears for non-aggression, pointing at prey, at territory, at the sun to indicate time. Somehow, across the species divide, basic communication happened. The archaeological record suggests these early encounters were cautious but not hostile. At Bachokiro Cave in Bulgaria, we find modern human tools in layers immediately above Neanderthal tools. No signs of violence, no evidence of sudden abandonment, just a transition, one people replacing another over generations. But Bulgaria was the periphery. In the heartland of Neanderthal territory, things were different. Modern humans tried to penetrate into France and Spain around 43,000 years ago. They failed. The archaeological evidence is clear. Modern human sites appear, last a few generations, then disappear. Neanderthal sites continue uninterrupted. These weren't military defeats. These were survival failures. Modern humans, despite their new technologies, couldn't compete with Neanderthals who had 300,000 years of the local experience. Every Neanderthal knew where to find winter shelter, where herds gathered, which plants were safe. Modern humans were strangers in a strange land, so they retreated and regrouped. For 3,000 years, Europe was divided. Modern humans held the east, Bulgaria, Romania, parts of Russia. Neanderthals held the west, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy. In between was a frontier, a zone where both species hunted, traded, and occasionally met. And when they met, sometimes they did more than trade. A modern human skeleton from Romania, dated to 40,000 years ago, tells an incredible story. This individual had a Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back. A great-great-great-grandmother, perhaps. Recent enough that Neanderthal features were still visible in the bones. This wasn't rape or conquest. This was integration. For a child to survive to adulthood in Ice Age conditions required community support. This hybrid individual was raised, fed, taught, protected. Their mixed heritage wasn't a barrier to acceptance. In at least some communities, the species boundary was permeable. But these were exceptions. Most of the time, the two species avoided each other. They had different hunting strategies, different seasonal patterns, different technological traditions. Like predators sharing a territory, they minimized contact to avoid conflict. This uneasy balance couldn't last. Around 42,000 years ago, the climate delivered a devastating blow. Heinrich Event 4 reached its peak. Temperatures crashed to levels not seen for millennia. The Scandinavian ice sheet surged south. Sea ice extended down to the coast of Portugal. For Neanderthals, this should have been manageable. They'd survived worse. They had all their cold weather adaptations, all their accumulated knowledge. But this time was different. This time they weren't facing the cold alone. Modern humans had spent those 3,000 years adapting. Not biologically, that takes far longer, but culturally, technologically. They'd learned from their failures. They'd developed new tools, new strategies. Most importantly, they'd developed something Neanderthals never had: long-distance social networks. A modern human in Romania could trade with relatives in Turkey. Innovation spread rapidly across vast distances. A better spear point designed in Russia could reach Spain in a generation. Information flowed. Where herds were moving, which territories were empty, where resources could be found. Neanderthals had networks too, but smaller, more local. A Neanderthal group might interact with 3 or 4 neighbouring groups. Modern humans maintained connections with dozens. When disaster struck, a failed hunt, a harsh winter, disease, modern humans could call on distant relatives for support. This difference became critical during the climate crisis. As conditions worsened, Neanderthal groups became increasingly isolated. The archaeological record shows their tool-making becoming more local, less diverse. They were pulling back, concentrating in refugia, losing contact with each other. Modern humans were doing the opposite. Their sites from this period show increasing standardization, suggesting more contact between groups, not less. They were sharing solutions, pooling knowledge, supporting each other through the crisis. But the real innovation that tipped the balance wasn't social. It was technological. Modern humans invented the eyed needle around 40,000 years ago. This tiny tool, carved from bone, revolutionized clothing. Instead of draped hides, they could create fitted garments, parkas with hoods, mittens, boots that actually sealed out snow. The difference was dramatic. A Neanderthal in traditional clothing might survive -20 degrees. A modern human in fitted clothing could handle -40. As temperatures continued dropping, this advantage became decisive. Neanderthals tried to adapt. Late Neanderthal sites show changes in toolmaking that might represent attempts to copy modern human innovations. The Châtelperronian industry, with its blade tools and bone implements, appears suddenly in the archaeological record, fully formed. Some archaeologists believe Neanderthals developed this independently. Others see modern human influence. The debate continues. But what's clear is that Neanderthals were innovating, trying new approaches, fighting to maintain their place in a changing world. It wasn't enough. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals had disappeared from Eastern Europe. By 39,000 years ago, they were gone from most of Central Europe. They held on in isolated pockets, southern Spain, Portugal, Gibraltar. But even there, their time was running out. The last stand happened in Gibraltar. This peninsula at the southern tip of Spain became a final refuge. The climate was milder than northern Europe. The sea provided resources when land hunting failed. Caves in the rock of Gibraltar offered perfect shelter. Here, Neanderthals made their last innovations. They developed new hunting strategies, targeting birds and rabbits instead of large game. They exploited marine resources more intensively than ever before. They even created art, abstract patterns carved into the cave walls. But they were trapped. To the north, modern humans occupied all of Spain. To the south, the Mediterranean blocked escape to Africa. The Neanderthal world had shrunk to a single peninsula, a few dozen square kilometers of territory. The end, when it came, wasn't dramatic. No final battle, no massacre, just a gradual fading. The last Neanderthal sites show decreasing population density, fewer tools, smaller hearths, longer gaps between occupations. The final Neanderthal remains date to around 28,000 years ago. They were found in Gorham's Cave, Gibraltar. A handful of tools, some charcoal from a last fire, the bones of a final meal, rabbit and tortoise, then nothing. The cave remained empty for thousands of years. After 300,000 years, the Neanderthal story ended. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. The last Neanderthal probably died alone, unaware they were the final representative of their species. There was no one to mourn them, no one to remember their passing, or was there? Modern humans moving into former Neanderthal territories found strange things. Caves with paintings too old to be theirs, tools in style they didn't recognize, burial sites with rituals they didn't understand. They must have wondered about the previous inhabitants. Some modern human groups adopted Neanderthal technologies. The Gravettian industry, which dominated Europe after Neanderthal extinction, incorporated elements from late Neanderthal toolmaking. Sites were reoccupied, traditions were continued. In a sense, modern humans became the inheritors of Neanderthal knowledge, but the real inheritance was genetic. Those hybrid individuals, the children of two species, carried both lineages forward. As modern humans spread across Europe, these genes spread with them. Natural selection kept the useful ones. Neanderthal genes that helped fight European diseases persisted. Genes for cold adaptation were retained. Genes for processing certain foods stayed in the population. Evolution didn't care about species boundaries. It kept what worked. Today, billions of people carry this inheritance. When someone survives a flu that might have been deadly, it might be Neanderthal immune genes making the difference. When someone tolerates cold better than expected, it might be Neanderthal metabolism genes at work. We are all part Neanderthal, but genes aren't the only legacy. Every time archaeologists uncover a Neanderthal site, we learn something new about humanity itself. These weren't our ancestors, but they were human. Their struggles, their triumphs, their daily lives tell us about the human experience in its most extreme form. They showed us that humanity isn't about technology or intelligence alone. It's about compassion in the face of hardship, creativity despite crushing daily demands, the determination to not just survive but to live, to find meaning, to leave something behind. In the frozen hell of the Ice Ages, Neanderthals kept the flame of humanity burning. They failed, ultimately, but their failure was magnificent. For 300,000 years, they defied odds that seem impossible. They turned the most hostile environment on Earth into home. They loved, laughed, created, and cared for each other when caring was a luxury they couldn't afford. Modern humans won the evolutionary contest. We had better tools, better communication, better networks. We could throw projectiles further, sew warmer clothes, coordinate larger groups. In the brutal arithmetic of natural selection, we had the advantages that mattered. But victory came at a cost. When the last Neanderthal died, humanity lost something irreplaceable. We lost a different way of being human, a species that found different solutions to the same problems, a perspective shaped by experiences we can barely imagine. Think about what Neanderthals could have contributed. Their intimate knowledge of Ice Age survival, their techniques for processing materials, their medicinal knowledge accumulated over millennia, their stories, their art, their unique view of the world. All of it died with them. We can reconstruct some of it from archaeological evidence. We can guess at their technologies, their social structures, their daily routines. But the living culture, the songs they sang, the stories they told, the jokes they laughed at, that's gone forever. Except perhaps in dreams. Some researchers speculate that Neanderthal genes might influence more than just our physical traits. The brain is shaped by genes too. When we feel that deep urge to hibernate in winter, that might be Neanderthal. When we're drawn to caves and sheltered spaces, that might be Neanderthal. When we stare into a fire and feel connected to something ancient, that's definitely Neanderthal. They were the first to make fire the centre of human life. For hundreds of thousands of years before us, they gathered around flames in the darkness, finding comfort in the light and warmth. That tradition passed to us, carried in genes and culture alike. Every campfire is a memorial to them, but the greatest lesson from Neanderthals isn't about the past. It's about the present and future. They showed that humans can adapt to anything, that no environment is too hostile, no challenge too great if we face it together. They also showed that adaptation has limits. Being perfectly suited to one environment can make you vulnerable when that environment changes. The very traits that made Neanderthals supreme Ice Age survivors, small populations, local focus, specific adaptations, made them vulnerable to competition and climate instability. We face our own changes now. Our climate is warming, not cooling, but changing just as dramatically. Our perfectly adapted modern civilization might be as vulnerable to change as Neanderthals were. The question is whether we can adapt quickly enough. Neanderthals couldn't, but they tried. Right up to the end, they were innovating, experimenting, struggling to find new ways forward. They didn't give up. They didn't surrender. They fought for survival with everything they had. That spirit, that refusal to quit, might be their greatest gift to us. When modern challenges seem overwhelming, when change seems too rapid, when the future appears dark, we can remember the Neanderthals. For 300,000 years they faced the impossible daily, and daily they prevailed, until they didn't. But even in extinction they achieved a kind of immortality. Their genes live on in us. Their innovations influenced our ancestors. Their story, slowly revealed by archaeology, continues to teach us about resilience, adaptation, and the price of survival. In a strange way, we are their revenge on extinction. Every human accomplishment contains a trace of Neanderthal contribution. When we climbed Everest, Neanderthal genes helped us handle the cold. When we cured diseases, Neanderthal immune genes played a role. When we made art, we followed a tradition they began. They lost the evolutionary race but won a place in the human story forever. The Ice Ages ended 10,000 years ago. The world warmed. Forests replaced tundra. The megafauna Neanderthals hunted went extinct. The environment they were perfectly adapted to disappeared. If they had survived just a little longer, would they have adapted to the warmer world? We'll never know, but we know they would have tried. That was their nature, to face whatever came with determination and ingenuity, to find ways to survive when survival seemed impossible. In the end, that's what makes them inspirational. Not their failure, but their incredible success. For 300,000 years they turned hell into home. They proved that humans, in whatever form, are capable of almost anything. The wind that screamed across the frozen steppes of Ice Age Europe carries a different message now. Not of death and ending, but of endurance and hope. Every archaeological discovery adds another chapter to their story. Every genetic study reveals another gift they left us. The Neanderthals are gone but not forgotten. In museums around the world, their bones tell their story. In laboratories, scientists decode their genes. In our own bodies, their biological innovations continue. They were our cousins, our competitors, our teachers. They were human in every way that matters. And in the end, perhaps that's the most important thing to remember. In the harshest conditions our planet has offered, humanity survived, changed, evolved, sometimes failing, but always enduring. The Neanderthals proved that we are stronger than we know. Their ice age is over. Ours, whatever form it takes, has yet to come. When it does, we'll face it with advantages they never had: global communication, advanced technology, accumulated knowledge of millennia. But we'll also face it with something they gave us: the genetic heritage of Ice Age survivors. The knowledge that humans can endure anything. The example of a species that never gave up, even when hope was gone. In our cells, in our culture, in our collective memory, the Neanderthals live on. They survived the Ice Ages in the only way that truly matters: through us. We are their legacy, their continuation, their triumph over extinction. The story that began with stocky figures moving through a blizzard doesn't end with an empty cave in Gibraltar. It continues every time a child is born with that 1 to 4% of DNA that says, "Your ancestors survived the impossible." It continues every time we face our own challenges with determination. The Neanderthals' greatest survival strategy wasn't their strong bodies or clever tools, it was their humanity. And that, more than genes or technologies, is what they passed on to us. The absolute refusal to let the darkness win. The insistence on creating light and warmth and meaning in a cold universe. 60,000 years ago, the world froze, but humanity endured, changed, evolved, sometimes nearly extinct but endured. The Neanderthals showed us how, and for that they deserve more than extinction. They deserve remembrance. But let's go back, before the end, before modern humans, back to when Neanderthals ruled undisputed. 100,000 years ago, in what's now Germany, something extraordinary happened. A Neanderthal woman fell through ice into a crevasse. She should have died instantly. The fall was over 30 feet, but she landed in deep snow that cushioned the impact. Injured, freezing, trapped, she faced certain death. Her group saved her. The archaeological evidence is stunning. Rope marks on the cave walls where they lowered someone down, scratches showing where they enlarged the opening. The woman's skeleton, healed from injuries that would have taken months of care. Think about the logistics of this rescue. They needed rope strong enough to hold a person's weight. They had to work in freezing conditions, probably in a blizzard. Someone had to descend into darkness not knowing what they'd find. Then they had to haul up an injured person without causing more damage. This wasn't instinct. This was planning, cooperation, determination. The woman who fell was approximately 25 years old. After her rescue, she lived another 15 years. Her bones show she never fully recovered. She walked with a limp, couldn't use one arm properly, yet she was kept with the group, fed, protected. In those 15 years, she probably had children. Her injured state wouldn't have prevented pregnancy. Those children carried forward not just genes, but the cultural memory of a group that doesn't abandon its members. Every descendant was living proof that their society valued life over efficiency. This pattern appears repeatedly in the Neanderthal record. At El Cedron in Spain, we find a family group that died together roughly 49,000 years ago. Genetic analysis reveals their relationships. 3 adult males related through the female line, 3 adult females from different genetic backgrounds, 3 adolescents, and 3 infants. They all died simultaneously, probably from starvation. The bones tell a horrific story. Cut marks indicate cannibalism, but not the ritualistic kind. These was desperate people in their last extremity. The fact that they died together suggests they chose to stay as a family, rather than scatter to improve individual chances. Even facing starvation, even reduced to cannibalism, they remained together. But here's the remarkable part. One of the adults had a genetic condition that would have made him different from birth. His bones show developmental abnormalities that would have been visible, unusual facial features, probably cognitive differences. Yet he was with the group, had been cared for his entire life. These weren't just survival machines, they were a family. The adolescents in the group were at the age where they'd normally leave to find mates. They could have struck out alone, might have had better chances. They stayed. The infants were probably already dead when the adults began to starve. They could have used them for food earlier. They didn't, until the very end. Even in their darkest moment, they maintained some kind of moral boundary. This complexity appears everywhere we look closely. At Krepina in Croatia, over 900 Neanderthal bones from at least 23 individuals were found. Initially interpreted as evidence of cannibalism, closer analysis revealed something different. These bones were deliberately broken, yes, but not for marrow extraction. They were broken in specific patterns at specific angles. Some were polished, others were arranged. This wasn't consumption. This was ritual processing. These Neanderthals were doing something with their dead that we don't understand, but it clearly had meaning beyond mere disposal. One theory suggests they were practicing excarnation. That's the deliberate defleshing of bones, sometimes practiced by modern cultures who believe it frees the spirit. The bones are then kept, buried, or arranged in meaningful ways. If true, it suggests Neanderthals had concepts of spirit, of afterlife, of meaning beyond the physical. But spiritual practices weren't separate from practical survival. At Fumain Cave in Italy, 44,000 years ago, someone painted a rock with red ochre in what appears to be a shamanic figure, half human, half animal. Near it were eagle talons and feathers. This wasn't random decoration. Eagles were powerful symbols. They flew highest, soar farthest, killed with precision. A Neanderthal wearing eagle feathers wasn't just decorating themselves. They were claiming the eagle's power, its perspective, its hunting prowess. In a world where survival required every advantage, spiritual and practical merged. This merger appears in their treatment of cave bears. Cave bears were both competitors and resources. They competed for caves, the best shelters in Ice Age Europe, but they were also sources of food, fur, and apparently spiritual power. At multiple sites we find cave bear skulls arranged in circles or lines. At Régordoux in France, a Neanderthal was buried with a cave bear skull placed deliberately over his body. The message seems clear. This person was associated with bear power. Perhaps they were a bear hunter, perhaps a shaman who claimed bear spirits, perhaps both. The relationship with cave bears was complex and dangerous. Cave bears were massive. Males could weigh half a ton. They were mostly herbivorous, but would defend their caves viciously. Every spring, Neanderthals faced a choice: wait for bears to leave their hibernation caves or force them out. Evidence suggests they often chose confrontation. We find cave bear bones with spear wounds, cut marks, clear evidence of butchering. But we also find Neanderthal bones with injuries consistent with bear attacks. This wasn't safe hunting. This was territorial warfare between two species that needed the same resource. One site tells a particularly dramatic story. In a cave in the Caucasus, archaeologists found layers of occupation. Bear, then Neanderthal, then bear, then Neanderthal. For thousands of years, these species traded possession of prime real estate. Each probably had to clean out the remains of the previous occupant. Imagine being the first Neanderthal to enter a cave after bears left. The smell would be overwhelming. Bear scat, urine, the remains of animals dragged in for consumption. But also opportunity. Abandoned cubs too weak to follow their mothers, cached food, thick layers of shed fur that could be used for bedding. Cave preparation was serious business. Neanderthals didn't just move into any available cave, they modified them. At Bruniquel, beyond those mysterious stone circles, we find evidence of floor levelling. They brought in sand and gravel to create dry, level surfaces. They dug drainage channels to direct water away from living areas. In some caves, they built walls, not massive fortifications, but simple stone arrangements to block wind, divide space, create privacy. At one site in France, a low wall separated the sleeping area from the working area. Another wall created what might have been a children's space, smaller, more protected, with toy-like objects nearby. Yes, Neanderthal children had toys. We find miniature versions of adult tools too small to be functional. Tiny hand axes that fit perfectly in a child's palm, miniature scrapers, small spear points. These weren't just abandoned, failed attempts by adults, they were practice tools, learning aids. At one site, we find what can only be described as a dollhouse, a small structure made of stacked stones, about the size of a shoebox, with carefully constructed walls and an opening. Near it were tiny animal figurines carved from bone. Some child 40,000 years ago was playing house while their parents worked. This investment in children was crucial for survival. Neanderthal children grew slowly like modern humans. Their brains needed years to develop fully. Teaching them survival skills required patience, time, resources. In a world where adults rarely lived past 30, childhood education was a race against parental mortality. The teaching methods were sophisticated. We find practice pieces showing progressive skill development. A child learning to knap flint would start with soft stone, making crude tools. As they improved, they'd move to harder stone, finer work. The progression is visible in the archaeological record. Clumsy attempts, improving technique, eventual mastery. But they weren't just learning practical skills. At Divja Babe in Slovenia, that controversial flute, whether made by Neanderthals or carnivore bites, was found with other musical evidence. Bones that could have been percussion instruments. Stones that ring when struck. If Neanderthals made music, children would have learned it. Music in the Ice Age served multiple purposes. It could coordinate group activities, everyone moving to the same rhythm. It could carry over long distances, drums echoing across valleys. It could encode information, different rhythms meaning different messages, and it could simply provide comfort in a harsh world. Imagine a Neanderthal lullaby, a mother humming to quiet a restless infant while winter winds howled outside. The melody passing from generation to generation, unchanged for millennia. The same notes that comforted a child in Ice Age Europe perhaps influencing the songs we sing today. But childhood wasn't all toys and lullabies. By age 10, Neanderthal children were contributing to survival. We find their smaller handprints in caves alongside adult ones. Their bones show the beginning of stress patterns from repetitive tasks. They were already learning their roles in the group's survival. Girls and boys probably had different educations. The wear patterns on teeth, from using them as a third hand, differ between males and females. Females show wear consistent with processing plant materials and hides. Males show wear from holding wooden shafts while shaping them. This doesn't mean rigid gender roles. At several sites, we find female skeletons with hunting injuries. Male skeletons show evidence of hide working. In a small group where every member was crucial, flexibility mattered more than tradition. One skeleton from Iraq tells an amazing story. This woman, about 30 years old, had a healed spear wound in her pelvis. The angle suggests she was facing her attacker, not running away, but fighting. She survived the wound, though it probably affected her mobility. Yet she continued to show wear patterns consistent with active hunting. She was a warrior who wouldn't quit. Her story wasn't unique. Neanderthal women were tough by necessity. They gave birth in Ice Age conditions without medical support. They nursed infants through winters when their own caloric needs were barely met. They probably hunted while pregnant, gathered while carrying infants. the mortality data is sobering. About 40% of Neanderthal fossils are from individuals who died before age 20. Another 40% died between 20 and 40. Only 20% made it past 40. These weren't deaths from old age. These were violent, difficult deaths. Yet they persisted in having children. The average Neanderthal woman probably had 4 to 6 pregnancies in her lifetime. With high infant mortality, perhaps 2 or 3 children survived to adulthood, just enough to maintain the population, barely. Pregnancy and nursing would have occupied most of a woman's adult life. In a world requiring 4,000 calories a day just for maintenance, a pregnant or nursing woman would need even more. The group had to provide. Every successful pregnancy was a communal investment in the future. Birth itself was dangerous. Neanderthal babies had large heads, like modern humans. Neanderthal women had wide pelvises, but birth was still difficult. Without medical intervention, complications meant death for mother, child, or both. We find evidence of what might be obstetric knowledge. At several sites, particular plants known to ease childbirth pain or prevent hemorrhaging are found concentrated in specific areas. These might have been birthing spaces prepared with medicinal plants. Someone knew what helped, what reduced risks. This knowledge extended to child rearing. Analysis of Neanderthal. Children's bones shows they were breastfed for about 2.5 years, then weaned gradually. This is similar to modern hunter-gatherers. It suggests organized child spacing, deliberate family planning. In a world where resources were scarce, having children too close together meant death. But spacing required knowledge of fertility, of how nursing suppresses ovulation, of the relationship between nutrition and reproduction. Neanderthals understood their own biology well enough to control it. This sophistication extended to their understanding of seasonal cycles. They knew when different animals gave birth, when they were fattest, when they migrated. They knew when different plants fruited, which mushrooms appeared after rain, where nuts accumulated. Their survival depended on perfect timing. At Salzgitter Lebenstädt in Germany, we find evidence of sophisticated planning. Reindeer bones at the site all come from autumn kills, but the site was occupied year-round. This means Neanderthals were preserving autumn-killed meat to last through winter and spring. They were thinking 6 months ahead. The preservation methods were varied. Smoking over low fires, drying in cold wind, freezing in permafrost caches, maybe even fermentation. Some modern Arctic peoples bury meat to ferment, creating a preserved, probiotic-rich food source. Neanderthals had the knowledge and necessity for such techniques, but preservation required salt. At coastal sites, this was easy. Seawater evaporation produces salt. But inland sites also show evidence of meat preservation. Were they trading for salt? Finding natural salt deposits? Using wood ash as a salt substitute? The answer reveals another layer of sophistication. At several sites, we find minerals that don't occur locally. Not just salt but ochre, particular types of stone, shells from distant seas. These materials travelled hundreds of kilometres. Through trade, gift exchange, or long-distance expeditions, Neanderthals accessed resources from across Europe. This network was their internet. Information travelled with goods. A shell from the Mediterranean reaching Germany carried news of southern conditions. Obsidian from a specific volcano told of hunting conditions in that region. The network kept groups connected across vast distances, but it was fragile. When climate deteriorated, when populations dropped, when travel became impossible, the network failed. Groups became isolated. Knowledge was lost. Innovations couldn't spread. This isolation may have been fatal. Modern humans maintained their networks even during crisis. Their trading connections actually intensified during cold periods. When local resources failed, they could access distant ones. When regional populations crashed, immigrants could arrive from connected areas. Neanderthals' more limited networks made them vulnerable. A volcanic eruption in Italy 40,000 years ago shows this vulnerability. The Campanian ignimbrite eruption covered much of Europe in ash. For years afterward, plants struggled, animals died or migrated, and survival became even harder. Modern humans recovered quickly. Their populations rebounded within centuries. Neanderthal populations never recovered. The archaeological record shows declining site occupation, reduced tool diversity, shrinking territories. The eruption wasn't extinction's cause, but it accelerated decline already underway. Yet even in decline, they innovated. The last Neanderthals created some of their finest tools, knives so sharp they rival surgical steel, points so precisely crafted they seem impossible without modern equipment. It's as if, facing extinction, they pushed their abilities to the absolute limit. At Gorham's cave, those final Neanderthals left something remarkable. A hashtag, literally. Carved into the cave floor, a symbol that looks exactly like a modern hashtag. It required hundreds of strokes to create. It serves no practical purpose. It's pure symbol, pure meaning. What did it mean? We'll never know. But someone, perhaps the last Neanderthal in Gibraltar, felt compelled to carve it, to leave a final mark, to say something to the universe before the darkness closed in. Maybe it was a territorial marker, maybe a spiritual symbol, maybe just the human need to create, persisting even at the end. Whatever it meant, it worked. 30,000 years later, we found it. We puzzle over it. We recognize it as communication across an impossible gulf of time. The last Neanderthal succeeded in speaking to the future, even if we can't understand the words. That hashtag in Gibraltar wasn't the only message they left. In those final years, as their world shrank, Neanderthals seemed to know something was ending. The archaeological record from their last sites shows behavior that looks like preparation, not for survival, for memory. At Gorham's cave, they cached things that made no sense. Perfect tools, unused, wrapped in hide and placed in crevices. Collections of shells and stones arranged in patterns. A child's tooth placed carefully with red ochre and an eagle feather. These weren't supplies. These were time capsules. Did they know we would find them? Probably not us specifically. But someone, someday. These final Neanderthals were surrounded by modern humans who looked different, acted different, lived different. Maybe they realized their way of life was ending. Maybe they wanted it remembered. The very last Neanderthal sites are heartbreaking in their smallness. Where once a cave might shelter 30 individuals, the final occupations show 3 or 4. Hearths that once blazed with mammoth bones now held twigs. Tool-making areas that produced hundreds of implements now show a handful. These weren't communities anymore. They were remnants. Imagine being one of these last Neanderthals. You grow up hearing stories of when your people were numerous, when every valley had a group, when seasonal gatherings brought together hundreds for mate selection, trade, celebration. Now you know 3 other families, maybe 4. Your parents are cousins. Your children will have to mate with their cousins or not at all. The old stories seem like fantasies. The techniques for mammoth hunting are useless. There are no mammoths left. The songs name places you'll never see. You're watching a world die. But here's what's remarkable. They kept going. Those last Neanderthals maintained their traditions. They still knapped stone in the way their ancestors taught. They still used red ochre. They still treated their dead with care. At La Ferracie, one of the last Neanderthal children was buried with more grave goods than any before. Stone tools he never got to use, shells from seas he never saw, the skull of a fox, possibly his favourite toy. Someone loved this child enough to bury wealth that the living needed. Even at the end, love mattered more than survival. This child was about 3 years old. His bones show signs of malnutrition, not starvation, but the slow weakness of insufficient variety. The last Neanderthals weren't dying dramatically. They were fading, generation by generation, getting weaker, smaller, fewer. His teeth tell another story. Microscopic analysis reveals he ate pine nuts, grass seeds, mushrooms, foods of desperation. The big game was gone. The reindeer herds had shifted their migration routes. The world that Neanderthals had mastered for 300,000 years no longer existed. Climate data from this period is brutal. The Le Champ event, 41,000 years ago, saw Earth's magnetic field temporarily reverse. Cosmic radiation increased. Auroras appeared at the equator. The ozone layer weakened. UV radiation spiked. For humans with dark skin, this meant nothing. For Neanderthals, evolved for low UV European environments, it meant cancer. Skin cancer, eye damage, immune suppression. Their light skin, perfect for synthesizing vitamin D in cloudy Europe, became a liability when the planet's magnetic shield failed. Modern humans had just arrived from Africa. They still had higher melanin levels. They could handle the radiation better. It wasn't the cause of Neanderthal extinction, but it was another pressure when they could least afford it. The world was becoming hostile to Neanderthal biology. But biology wasn't their only problem. The social fabric was tearing. With populations so small, finding mates outside your immediate family became impossible. The genetic evidence is stark. Those last Neanderthals were deeply inbred. One girl from Siberia had parents who were half-siblings. Her genome shows runs of homozygosity, identical DNA from both parents, that could only come from severe inbreeding. This wasn't choice. This was the mathematics of extinction. When your total population is in the hundreds, your options disappear. Inbreeding brought its own horrors. Genetic disorders that were rare became common. Cleft palates that made nursing difficult. Heart defects that killed in childhood. Cognitive impairments that prevented learning survival skills. Each generation was weaker than the last. Yet they persisted in trying. Women kept getting pregnant despite knowing most babies wouldn't survive. Men kept hunting despite declining success. Children kept learning traditional skills despite their irrelevance. The machinery of culture continued even as the world it was built for vanished. At El Cedron, we find evidence of their last medical knowledge. An adult male with a painful dental abscess was eating poplar bark, aspirin, and antibiotic mold. Someone knew these treatments. Someone cared enough to find and prepare them. Even as their species died, compassion survived. This man's DNA tells us something else. He had genes for red hair and pale skin. In his group of 12, at least 3 were redheads. Imagine that. A family of red-haired Ice Age survivors, distinct, visible, undeniably different from the dark-haired modern humans surrounding them. They must have seemed like ghosts to modern humans, pale, stocky figures glimpsed at distance, speaking in unknown languages, using ancient techniques, living in places modern humans found inhospitable. They were living fossils, relics of an older world. Some modern humans clearly interacted peacefully with them. The hybrid individuals prove that. But what did those interactions look like? A modern human trading party encountering a Neanderthal group, communication through gestures and shared objects, perhaps curiosity overcoming fear, maybe even something like love. For hybrid children to survive, there had to be acceptance. A modern human woman bearing a half-Neanderthal child needed her group's support. A Neanderthal woman joining a modern human group needed protection, inclusion. These weren't just matings, they were relationships. Somewhere, 40,000 years ago, a modern human and a Neanderthal looked past the differences and saw something worth preserving. Their children carried both legacies forward. We are their descendants. But these unions were rare. Most of the time, the two species avoided each other. Competition for resources was too intense. Cultural differences too vast. The uncanny valley effect too disturbing. They were human enough to recognize, different enough to fear. As modern human populations exploded, Neanderthals retreated. Not geographically, they had nowhere left to go, but socially, pulling back into themselves, minimizing contact. The archaeological record shows increasing isolation, decreasing trade, cultural involution. They were choosing extinction over assimilation. This wasn't stupidity or stubbornness, it was identity. For 300,000 years they'd been themselves. Their way of life, their traditions, their physical form, all interconnected. To abandon any part meant abandoning all. A Neanderthal couldn't become a modern human. The physical differences were obvious. But the mental architecture was different too. Their brains, while large, were organized differently. The areas we use for language and social coordination were smaller. The areas for visual processing and body control were larger. They literally saw the world differently. Their visual cortex was 40% larger than ours. They might have seen details we miss, tracked movement we can't follow, noticed patterns invisible to us. Their world was richer in visual information, poorer in social abstraction. This affected everything. Their tools remained individually crafted rather than standardized because they saw each stone's unique properties. Their group stayed small because they couldn't process larger social networks. Their art was abstract because representation wasn't how they thought. When we look at Neanderthal art, we're seeing alien cognition. Those geometric patterns weren't failed attempts at representation. They were how Neanderthals encoded meaning. The hashtag at Gorham's cave might have contained libraries of information we can't decode because we don't think that way. Their extinction was partly a failure of translation. Modern humans couldn't understand Neanderthal knowledge. Neanderthals couldn't adapt to modern human social structures. Two kinds of human consciousness, incompatible at scale, competing for the same niche. We won because we were louder, not literally, though modern human sites are noisier archaeologically, but socially louder, bigger groups, more communication, faster information spread. In the competition between depth and breadth, breadth won, but something was lost. that visual richness, that intimate environmental knowledge, that different way of being human. We kept the genes that helped us survive but lost the consciousness that created them. Every Neanderthal who died took irreplaceable knowledge. The last person who knew how to track cave bears through snow by scent. The last person who could predict weather by the sound of the wind in specific valleys. The last person who understood what the hashtag meant. Entire libraries of survival wisdom deleted. Modern humans moving into former Neanderthal territories had to rediscover everything. Which caves were safe, which plants were edible, where animals wintered. Knowledge that took millennia to accumulate had to be rebuilt from scratch. We almost didn't make it. 28,000 years ago, shortly after the last Neanderthal died, modern human populations in Europe crashed. The archaeological record shows site abandonment, population bottlenecks, regional extinctions. Without Neanderthals to learn from, we nearly failed too. What saved us was Africa. New waves of modern humans arrived, bringing fresh genes and ideas. They repopulated empty territories, revived failing populations. The European modern human recovery was actually a recolonization. But those new arrivals found something unexpected. The first wave of modern humans, the ones who'd met Neanderthals, were different. They carried Neanderthal genes, yes, but also something else. Techniques that weren't African. Knowledge that seemed locally evolved. They'd learned from the Neanderthals. Not directly. The species barrier prevented that. But through observation, experimentation, and those rare hybrid individuals who bridged both worlds. Modern humans had become students of extinction. The Gravettian culture that followed showed this hybrid knowledge. Venus figurines with Neanderthal-like body proportions, burial practices combining both traditions. Tool-making that merged techniques. We were becoming something new, not modern human or Neanderthal, but a fusion. That fusion is us. Every human alive today outside Africa carries this merger. We are the children of two experiments in humanity, the inheritors of double wisdom, the living proof that love can transcend species. When we dream of caves, that might be Neanderthal memory. When we feel that deep winter sadness, that urge to hibernate, that's Neanderthal neurology. When we survive impossibly cold conditions, that's Neanderthal metabolism. We carry them in ways we're only beginning to understand. Recent genetics revealed something stunning. Neanderthal genes aren't randomly distributed in our genome. They cluster in specific regions: the immune system, metabolism, skin and hair, the brain. Evolution kept what worked and placed it precisely. We are engineered hybrids. Natural selection spent 40,000 years optimizing the blend, keeping Neanderthal disease resistance while maintaining modern human social cognition, preserving cold adaptations while enabling global spread. We are what both species were evolving toward. But the optimization came at a cost. Each generation that kept helpful Neanderthal genes also lost others. Genes that might have given us their visual acuity, their muscle strength, their different consciousness. We kept the survival tools but lost the alternate humanity. Today, we can sequence Neanderthal genomes but can't resurrect their minds. We can clone their genes but not their culture. We can imagine their lives but not live them. They are gone in every way that matters. Except one. We remember them, not their specific stories. Those are lost. But their existence, their struggle, their humanity, every museum display, Every research paper, every documentary is an act of remembrance. We are their only mourners. No Neanderthal got to bury the last of their kind. No one sang funeral songs or told their stories. They died unmourned, unremembered, unknown, until we found them again and began the long work of reconstruction. Every fossil we uncover is a resurrection. Every site we excavate is a homecoming. Every gene we sequence is a voice from the darkness. We are slowly, painstakingly, lovingly bringing them back, not to life, that's impossible, but to memory. And what a memory it is. 300,000 years of survival against impossible odds. Generations beyond counting who faced each frozen dawn with determination. Love and loss, triumph and tragedy, played out in caves we now visit as tourists. They were giants, not physically. They were actually shorter than us, but giants of endurance, of adaptation, of raw human will. They took a hostile planet and made it home through pure refusal to quit. When we face our own challenges, we should remember them. Climate change, pandemic, war. These seem overwhelming. But we are the descendants of people who survived worse, who faced extinction and fought back, who carried injured companions through blizzards because leaving them was unthinkable. We have their genes. We have their strength. That 4% of Neanderthal DNA isn't just molecular machinery. It's a message from the Ice Age. You're tougher than you know. Your ancestors survived the unsurvivable. You carry that power. When winter depression hits, remember it's Neanderthal preparation for hibernation. When you feel that deep loneliness, remember it's Neanderthal group bonding instinct. When you stare into fire and feel connected to something ancient, you're right, you are. They are not extinct. They evolved into us. The last Neanderthal didn't die in Gibraltar 30,000 years ago. They transformed, merged, became part of something larger. Every child born today with that genetic legacy is proof that love conquers even extinction. But their greatest gift isn't genetic, it's perspective. They showed us that humanity isn't one thing, that there are different ways to be human, that consciousness itself can take multiple forms, that intelligence isn't just about social coordination and language. They were our path not taken. In another timeline, Neanderthals survived and we went extinct. Earth would have a different humanity, quieter perhaps, more visual, less social but more observant. Cities might never have developed, or they might be unimaginably different. We'll never know that world. But knowing it was possible changes how we see our own. Our way isn't the only way. Our consciousness isn't the only consciousness. Our survival strategy isn't the only strategy. The Neanderthals proved that. For 300,000 years they proved it daily. In every successful hunt, every child raised, every winter survived. They were humanity's first great experiment, and they succeeded beyond imagination. They didn't fail. They completed. Their story had an ending, yes, but what a story it was. From emergence to extinction, they never gave up, never surrendered, never stopped being magnificently, impossibly, inspirationally human. The wind that screamed across the frozen steppes has finally quieted. The caves are empty of their fires. The hunting grounds know them no more. But in our cells, in our dreams, in our deepest instincts, the Neanderthals live on. We are their revenge on extinction. We are their message to the future. We are proof that they mattered. 60,000 years ago the world froze. A group of stocky figures moved through a blizzard, searching for shelter. They found it. They survived it. They conquered it. And then, when their time was done, they passed the torch to us. We carry it still, in our genes, in our culture, in our stubborn refusal to quit when quitting would be reasonable. Every time we face the impossible and prevail, we honor them. The Neanderthals didn't survive the Ice Age. They became it. They merged with it so completely that they became inseparable from that frozen world. When the ice retreated, so did they, not in defeat, but in completion. Their chapter was written, their story told, and what a story! What a magnificent, terrible, beautiful story. 300,000 years of facing the impossible daily, of choosing compassion when cruelty would be easier, of maintaining humanity in conditions that demanded becoming monsters. They showed us what we are capable of, not just survival. Any animal can survive, but meaning in the face of meaninglessness, beauty in the face of horror, love in the face of death. That's what makes us human. The Neanderthals knew that, in their bones, in their art, in their careful burial of their dead. They knew. Life isn't about duration but intensity, not about winning but about refusing to lose, not about survival but about what you survive for. They survived for each other, for the children who deserved a chance, for the elderly who deserved dignity, for the injured who deserved care, for the group that was more than its members, for the future they'd never see. They survived for us. Somewhere, a Neanderthal parent teaching a child to knap flint was preserving knowledge that would eventually reach us. Somewhere, a Neanderthal artist painting a cave wall was sending a message that would take 40,000 years to deliver. Message received. You are here. You mattered. You are human. You are our teachers, our predecessors, our genetic contributors. But more than that, you are our inspiration. Proof that humans can face anything if they face it together. The Ice Ages ended. The Neanderthals ended. But the story they began continues in every human alive. We are all children of the Ice Age. We all carry the strength of those who refused to surrender. When the next Ice Age comes, literal or metaphorical, we'll be ready. Because the Neanderthals showed us how.